May 1945, northern Germany. The air is still heavy with smoke from burned-out villages. Snow mixes with ash, drifting like quiet ghosts across a broken field. A line of German women, their faces pale, eyes hollow, stand under the gray sky. They once wore the proud symbols of the Reich: eagle crests, swastika armbands, field gray uniforms pressed to perfection. Now those same emblems lie piled before them, a mountain of cloth, buttons, and insignia that once promised glory. An Allied officer steps forward. His voice is calm, almost detached. "Burn them." One by one, the women step closer. Some hesitate, some weep silently. Others obey without a word. The fire crackles to life, orange against the cold mist. Smoke rises, carrying the last traces of a collapsing empire into the sky. For these women, nurses, secretaries, radio operators, the uniform was their identity, their protection, their pride. Now, as it turns to ash, so too does everything they believed in. The war is over, but the reckoning has just begun. It is the winter of 1944, turning into 1945. The Third Reich is dying, though few inside Berlin dare to admit it. The Allied advance from the west and the Soviet flood from the east are closing the last arteries of Germany's power. Cities once vibrant with parades now lie in rubble. The sound of marching boots has been replaced by the distant thunder of artillery. Inside government buildings, orders still flow from the crumbling hierarchy. Goebbels screams of total war, while Hitler, hidden in his bunker, clings to maps that no longer match reality. The German army is bleeding out. Millions of soldiers are dead, captured, or missing. The once formidable Wehrmacht has become a shadow force made of old men, wounded veterans, and most strikingly, young women called from the home front. From the earliest years of the Nazi regime, women were told their purpose was to serve the fatherland through motherhood and obedience. Children, kitchen, church, Kinder, Küche, Kirche became the mantra. Yet, as war consumed Europe, ideology bent under necessity. The same regime that promised women would never wear uniforms soon demanded they do. Through the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, Untintues Certificatenatarius, the League of German Girls, an entire generation was conditioned to believe in sacrifice and purity of duty. Rallies, songs, and speeches turned devotion into ritual. By 1943, many of these girls, barely 18, were trained in radio operation, anti-aircraft observation, field nursing, and clerical work for the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and SS. When Allied bombing intensified, thousands of women volunteered or were conscripted into the Helferinnenkorps, the Auxiliary Corps. They manned searchlights, tracked enemy aircraft, relayed messages to flak batteries, and served as medical aides at the front. Uniforms, once forbidden, now became symbols of patriotic pride. Propaganda posters showed smiling blonde women with headsets or Red Cross armbands, captioned with promises of honor and heroism. But behind the images lay exhaustion, hunger, and fear. These women worked in freezing bunkers, often under bombardment, surrounded by the wounded and dying. By the end of 1944, the illusion of victory had completely vanished. The Ardennes offensive failed. The Red Army tore through Poland and reached the Oder River. Refugee columns of civilians, mostly women and children, choked every road leading west. The Nazi command still ordered no retreat. Inside cities like Königsberg, Danzig, and Breslau, female auxiliaries stood beside desperate soldiers, relaying hopeless orders over shattered lines. The sound of Soviet artillery echoed like approaching judgment. They saw their world collapse, not from distance, but from within the very offices where they typed, decoded, and treated the broken. For many of these women, surrender was unthinkable. Years of indoctrination had taught them that capture by the Allies, especially by the Soviets, meant humiliation or death. Pamphlets and radio broadcasts insisted that the enemy would destroy German womanhood itself, so they stayed, working until the last shells fell. Yet, when the inevitable came, their courage and conditioning collided. On the Western Front, U.S. and British soldiers were stunned to find women in full uniform among the captured staff of airfields and command posts. Some tried to maintain military bearing, saluting officers who no longer held command. Others collapsed in disbelief, whispering prayers for a Führer who was already gone. The German military uniform was never just clothing. It was an identity, stitched with authority, precision, and ideology. For male and female alike, the gray wool and black leather embodied belonging to something greater than oneself. When Allied forces began ordering uniforms to be stripped and destroyed, it was more than humiliation. It was the deliberate dismantling of a belief system. Each armband burned meant the erasure of an oath. Each insignia thrown into fire severed a lifetime of faith. The Allied officers understood that this act carried psychological weight. The flames were not merely consuming fabric. They were consuming symbols of fanaticism. As German women watched their uniforms burn, they stood at the threshold between two worlds: the world of blind conviction and the world of accountability waiting beyond defeat. And while some still clung to pride, others felt only emptiness, because behind the ashes lay a question no one had prepared them to face. If everything they had believed was a lie, then who were they now? Spring 1945. Germany had ceased to exist as it once was. The front lines dissolved into chaos, and the Reich's territories were carved apart by advancing armies. The roads were flooded with refugees, mothers, wounded soldiers, children, and thousands of young women in uniform who had once served the Nazi war machine. In the final weeks, surrender came in fragments. Units fell apart, cities raised white flags, and the command network crumbled. But many of the women attached to field hospitals, signal units, and Luftwaffe bases refused to abandon their posts. Some waited for orders that never came. Others continued typing messages for divisions that no longer existed. When Allied patrols arrived, they found order amid ruin. Desks neatly arranged, telephones still ringing, typewriters still clattering. Women in crisp gray skirts and tunics stood at attention, their faces marked by fatigue and disbelief. They had followed the rules until the very end, because the rules were all they had left. Allied soldiers, hardened by years of combat, were initially stunned. They had fought SS men and Wehrmacht troops across Europe, but few had expected to find women in military uniform, armed not with rifles, but with radios and medical kits. In Denmark, Norway, and northern Germany, entire units of female Luftwaffe Helferinnen, Air Force auxiliaries, surrendered together. Some marched in formation, others raised makeshift white flags, stitched from bedsheets. The British and Americans treated them as prisoners of war, but with strict separation from male soldiers. The Soviets, however, saw no distinction. To them, every German in uniform was the enemy. Stories spread quickly: brutal interrogations, public humiliations, and assaults. Soviet propaganda depicted these women not as victims, but as willing servants of fascism. For the women, captivity was not just physical. It was psychological disintegration. The world that had defined their purpose vanished overnight. The swastika they once polished with pride now marked them for shame. In the British and American zones, the process of Entnazifizierung, denazification, began almost immediately. The Allies understood that symbols carried power. Uniforms, medals, and insignia were more than military decorations. They were emblems of ideology. Orders were issued. Every Nazi symbol must be destroyed. Flags, armbands, caps, and uniforms were to be burned under supervision. The women POWs were made to watch, and, in many camps, to carry out the destruction themselves. Piles of gray wool, red banners, and leather belts were thrown into pits. The smell of burning fabric mixed with smoke and fear. Some wept as they obeyed. Others refused at first, clinging to the only structure they had ever known. One British officer later recalled the sight. They looked lost, like children who had been told their God was dead. For the Allied command, the order was practical, a way to eliminate militarism, to ensure that no remnants of Nazi uniforms could be reused or idolized. But for the women, it became a ceremony of loss. The flames consumed not just cloth, but identity. Many had joined out of necessity, not conviction. Daughters of families destroyed by war, young women who sought belonging or safety in uniform. Yet the ideology they served had fused service with faith. When they burned their uniforms, they were burning themselves. In the East, there were no such controlled rituals. The Red Army's vengeance was immediate and personal. Women in German uniforms were stripped of dignity, often violently. Survivors later spoke in whispers of nights filled with fear, of guards who mocked them for serving Hitler, of starvation and despair. In Soviet captivity, few uniforms survived the first week. They were torn, confiscated, or destroyed. But the psychological burning happened all the same. Every badge of rank, every insignia became a mark of guilt. As days passed into weeks, a strange silence fell over the camps. The women stopped speaking of the Führer. They stopped singing the songs they had once known by heart. The belief system that had given them meaning now felt like a betrayal. For the first time, they began to see the full scale of destruction. The photographs of concentration camps, the testimonies of survivors, the endless columns of displaced people. Many could not comprehend it. Others refused to believe. The burning of uniforms was more than punishment. It was the moment of awakening or collapse. It separated the believers from the broken. And among the ashes, the question lingered in the smoke. If obedience had led them here, what did freedom even mean? The fire had erased the emblems of the Reich, but it had also exposed the naked truth beneath them. And in that silence, amid the wreckage of war, the next chapter began, one that would test not just soldiers, but the human spirit itself. When the order came to burn their uniforms, the silence was almost sacred. These women had served the Reich not as soldiers in trenches, but as the silent machinery of its war, typing, bandaging, transmitting, believing. Many had entered service as girls filled with patriotic fervor. Now they stood as prisoners, facing the death of that belief. Historians later described their expressions in Allied photographs: blank, tearful, stunned. One British war correspondent wrote that they looked neither defeated nor defiant, but hollowed out. The physical exhaustion of war mixed with moral disorientation. What had once been pride was now a stain. For some, obedience persisted even after defeat. They lined up neatly, saluting before throwing their uniforms into the fire as if completing one final command. For others, the act broke something deep within. They clutched their collars, pressed insignias to their chests, unable to let go. Psychologists studying post-war trauma among German POWs noted that women often exhibited identity collapse. They had not only lost their nation, they had lost the framework of purpose. Many had believed sincerely in service, not necessarily in hatred. Yet now both were intertwined. Letters smuggled from British camps tell of confusion and guilt. We did not kill, but we carried the message of those who did. Another wrote, "It was not the uniform that burned. It was the part of me that once believed in it." The burning became, for many, a quiet funeral, not for fallen comrades, but for a broken faith. To Allied commanders, this act was deliberate psychology. Victory on the battlefield was not enough. Nazism had to be uprooted from the German mind. Denazification was not only about arresting war criminals or dismantling propaganda machines, it was about erasing symbols that gave ideology its visual power. The Nazi uniform was perhaps the most potent symbol of the regime. Designed with militaristic precision, it embodied unity, discipline, and fear. The black SS tunic, the field gray army jacket, the Red Cross armband, all were crafted to represent control and belonging. When Allied officers ordered POWs to destroy their uniforms, they were applying an early form of psychological demilitarization. By forcing the act of destruction, they transferred responsibility from victors to the defeated. The Germans themselves had to dismantle the image of the Reich. Reports from U.S. Army psychological operations units mention how prisoners reacted differently. Male soldiers often displayed anger or defiance. Women, however, displayed grief. One British officer wrote that he saw tears, not protests. The Allies understood that ideology lived through ritual. By reversing the ritual, turning the uniform from sacred to forbidden, they severed the emotional link to the Nazi cause. It was symbolic warfare after the war had ended. Even the timing was strategic. In many regions, these burnings took place during the first days of occupation, when shock was still raw. The Allies wanted to define the new order immediately, not through violence, but through control of meaning. For women prisoners, this order carried an additional layer of humiliation. In a regime that had told them they were the embodiment of German virtue, being forced to destroy their own symbol of service was a public dismantling of identity. The psychological wound lingered long after captivity ended. In post-war testimonies, former Helferinnen described this act as the moment they realized Germany was not occupied. It was broken. And the fire that consumed their uniforms was, in many ways, the first light of the new world. The Nazi regime was obsessed with design, uniformity, and control, from architecture to clothing. Every thread of the uniform served a function beyond comfort. It was propaganda stitched into fabric. The cut of a jacket, the shine of a button, the tilt of a cap, all carried psychological intent. Even the shade of field gray was selected to convey both modernity and discipline. For women's units, this precision extended to hairstyles, accessories, and even the angle of salute. By 1944, uniform production had become one of the Reich's largest logistical operations. Factories across Germany and occupied territories worked day and night, producing attire for men and women alike. Over 400 million pieces of military clothing during the war. Women's uniforms, while simpler, were carefully standardized to convey authority without masculinity. A calculated aesthetic meant to balance femininity with service. The destruction of these garments, then, had industrial as well as symbolic weight. Allied forces collected piles of uniforms from depots, hospitals, and training centers. Tons of fabric representing years of propaganda and power. Burning them was not only psychological but also practical. The Allies feared that leftover uniforms might fuel underground movements or help Nazi fugitives disguise themselves. In camp after camp, the fires consumed tons of history. Wool, cotton, insignias, even boots. Some were documented by war photographers, though few images survived censorship. Those that remain show grim faces, smoke rising, the Reich literally turning to dust. For historians, this moment reveals the precision with which Nazi identity had been engineered, and how fragile it became once stripped of its symbols. Without the uniform, the ideology lost its visible armor. To the women forced to carry out the burnings, this technological collapse was intimate. The tools of propaganda they had once worn now burned in their hands. The machinery of control had finally turned against its creators. The flames of those fires marked not just the end of uniforms, but the beginning of reckoning. And as the smoke cleared, another set of truths began to emerge. Those of leadership, vengeance, and morality in the ruins of defeat. The order for women to serve in military support roles had not come easily in Hitler's Germany. In the 1930s, the Führer declared that a woman's battlefield was the home, her weapon, the cradle. But by 1943, as German losses grew catastrophic, that promise was quietly broken. Heinrich Himmler and Albert Speer began mobilizing female labor on a massive scale. Women were pulled from offices, schools, and even convents to fill the void left by fallen soldiers. They became radio operators, anti-aircraft spotters, medics, and clerks. Many served directly under the SS, though most were civilians under military command. Yet as the war turned against Germany, those same leaders abandoned them. Himmler fled. Goebbels preached honor in death. Hitler, in his bunker, fantasized of victory even as the city above him burned. None of them prepared the women for surrender. None gave orders for their protection. The regime that had once exalted discipline and loyalty now dissolved into chaos and cowardice. When Allied troops arrived, many of these women still awaited instructions that would never come. Some continued transmitting messages to divisions that had ceased to exist. Others burned documents, believing they were protecting secrets. In those final weeks, the Nazi leadership's betrayal was absolute. They had promised the women glory, purity, and purpose. What they left them with was shame, captivity, and ashes. Later interrogations revealed the depth of disillusionment. One former Helferin told British officers, "We were told that Germany would never surrender. We were told we were the wall between chaos and order. But when the end came, there was no wall. Only lies." The leadership's collapse was not just military, it was moral. The same men who preached loyalty had abandoned their most loyal servants. And in the silence after the fire, the women realized what they had truly served. Not honor, but illusion. To the Allied and Soviet forces who occupied Germany, these women were not innocent civilians. They were part of the machinery that had fueled the Reich's aggression. For the Soviets especially, vengeance ran deep. They had seen villages burned, families slaughtered, and comrades executed under German occupation. To them, every German in uniform, man or woman, carried the guilt of the regime. In the Soviet-occupied territories, captured female auxiliaries were treated with suspicion, often brutality. Many were paraded through streets, mocked, and stripped of their uniforms publicly. It was revenge disguised as justice. Soviet newspapers portrayed them as willing servants of fascism, the daughters of the beast. In contrast, the Western Allies approached them with a mixture of caution and curiosity. American intelligence reports described them as obedient, efficient, and psychologically fractured. The British categorized them under Category C, POWs, low threat, but ideologically tainted. In propaganda films shown across liberated Europe, the image of German women soldiers burning their uniforms was powerful. It served as proof that Nazism was dead. Cameras lingered on faces, young, tear-streaked, expressionless, as the fires consumed the last symbols of tyranny. For the world watching, it was justice made visible. But for the women themselves, it was humiliation made eternal. They were neither heroes nor monsters, only remnants of a destroyed system. Yet history, especially in the first years after the war, had no patience for nuance. The narrative demanded villains, and they fit easily into the frame. The Allies had defeated an army, but what they also witnessed, perhaps unknowingly, was the death of an entire generation's innocence. The moral weight of what these women represented would haunt post-war Europe for decades. Were they victims of propaganda or willing participants in evil? The answer was never simple. Most had joined for practical reasons: wages, safety, belonging. Yet each had worn the symbols of a genocidal regime. They may not have fired guns or issued orders, but they transmitted messages, logged reports, and enabled the machinery of war to function smoothly. After 1945, this question, how much guilt belonged to those who obeyed, became central to Germany's reckoning. Philosopher Hannah Arendt would later call it the banality of evil. Ordinary people performing duties without questioning their moral weight. In the camps and re-education centers, Allied officers tested loyalty through questionnaires. Were you a member of the Nazi Party? Did you believe in Hitler? Why did you join? Answers varied, some defiant, others remorseful. A few refused to answer at all. But the fire had already spoken for them. In that burning pile of uniforms, there was no separation between the innocent and the guilty. Only the shared realization that belief without conscience leads to ruin. Decades later, historians and survivors alike would revisit this question. Could those women have resisted? Or had the system consumed them from birth? One diary, found near Flensburg in 1946, captured the quiet tragedy of it all. We believed we were serving our people. Now our people spit on us. The world calls us monsters. I only wish someone had told us sooner what we were part of. The moral collapse of the Reich was not confined to its leaders. It seeped through every uniform, every order followed without question, every act of obedience mistaken for duty. And when the uniforms burned, so did the illusion of innocence. The flames had revealed the truth of power, belief, and betrayal. But the story was not finished. Because in the days that followed, as Berlin fell and the Reich signed its final surrender, those same fires would ignite one last act of reckoning. A moment when the women of the Third Reich faced the undeniable end, May 6, 1945. Berlin had fallen. Soviet banners fluttered over the Reichstag. In bunkers beneath the ruined capital, Hitler's corpse lay beside that of Eva Braun. The radio broadcasts that had once declared eternal victory now stuttered with static. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted only 12. Across Germany and occupied Europe, surrender spread like a contagion. In Denmark, Norway, Austria, and the Netherlands, entire garrisons received the same message: cease operations immediately. But confusion reigned. Many units had lost communication. For female auxiliaries, the Luftwaffe Helferinnen and Wehrmachtshelferinnen, orders were fragmentary, often contradictory. Some commanders told them to destroy documents. Others urged them to flee before the Soviets arrived. At Flensburg, the provisional government under Admiral Karl Dönitz still pretended to rule a nation that no longer existed. Dönitz's staff included hundreds of women typists, nurses, and communication aides. They continued to type memoranda, stamping them with Nazi eagles that had already lost all meaning. In those sterile offices, the fantasy of control persisted, until British patrols arrived. At airfields across northern Germany, Allied forces encountered entire detachments of female personnel waiting in formation. In places like Schleswig, Oldenburg, and Lübeck, lines of women stood beside their officers, dressed in immaculate field gray, caps squared, eyes forward. They saluted the approaching British and American troops with mechanical precision, but there was no salute in return, only silence and the leveling of rifles. The officers read the terms of unconditional surrender. All uniforms bearing Nazi insignia were to be removed, collected, or destroyed. No swastika, no eagle, no trace of the Reich would survive. For the women, the words felt unreal. They had served loyally, some since the first bombs fell on Hamburg. They had lost brothers, fiancés, entire families to the war. Yet now, stripped of their uniforms, they were told they had been serving evil. The British kept their tone firm but restrained. The Americans, practical as always, ordered the process to begin immediately. Piles of clothing, caps, and armbands grew in the fields. Allied photographers recorded the moment for history, a final act of erasure. In one surviving account from the 11th Armored Division near Hamburg, an officer recalled, "They stood in silence as the uniforms burned. Not one spoke. You could see in their faces the realization. The world they were trained to die for was gone. At the edge of airstrips and camp yards, the fires began. Gray smoke coiled into the sky, thick with the smell of wool and leather. Buttons popped in the heat. The once precise insignia, eagles, bolts, iron crosses, curled and melted. Some women watched in stoic silence. Others trembled. A few fainted. A Red Cross nurse reportedly whispered prayers as her armband turned to ash. One Helferin clutched her cap to her chest until a guard gently pulled it away. To the Allies, it was just procedure. To the women, it was annihilation of identity. Every stitch had meant belonging, every badge purpose. Now, stripped and anonymous, they faced an unfamiliar kind of freedom. One that felt like exile. Even as uniforms burned in the West, in the East, the destruction was far less orderly. Soviet forces overran German positions with brutal swiftness. In captured towns, women in uniform were often seized, interrogated, and stripped of insignia on the spot. Some were executed as SS collaborators. Others were marched eastward into camps from which few returned. The contrast between the two fronts was stark. In the West, structured surrender. In the East, vengeance. But beneath both, the same truth burned. The collapse of belief. Inside the minds of those women, the fire represented more than defeat. It was the death of faith itself. Years of indoctrination had taught them that Hitler was infallible, that Germany's destiny was eternal. Yet here they stood, surrounded by enemies, forced to destroy the very symbols of that destiny. Some whispered that the Führer would return, that the Allies were lying. Others wept quietly as the flames consumed their oaths. A few refused to burn their uniforms and were threatened with arrest. Most complied, their hands trembling. The fire was not a punishment. It was a ritual of cleansing, designed by the victors, endured by the defeated. Local civilians watched from a distance. Women in ragged clothes, widows and refugees, stared at the spectacle of their country's daughters burning their pride. Some felt pity, others spat in disgust. A farmer's wife in Schleswig was overheard saying, "Now they know what it feels like to lose everything." British soldiers, though hardened, could not forget the sight. Many wrote about it later. The eerie quiet, the smell of smoke, the strange dignity of women watching their world vanish. It was not victory in the usual sense. It was something colder, the kind of ending that left no joy, only silence. For the prisoners, the days that followed were unreal. They were taken to temporary camps, given food and medical checks. Some felt relief. The war was finally over. But others sank into depression. Without uniforms, ranks, or purpose, they wandered the fields like ghosts. In interrogation tents, Allied officers asked the same questions again and again. Why did you serve? What did you believe? Did you know what was happening in the camps? Most answered with confusion, some with denial. We only did our duty. We never saw the front. We thought we were helping. But duty was no longer a shield. The fire had exposed what obedience had concealed. When the last flames died, only charred fabric and melted badges remained. The women were ordered to move on, to begin their journey into captivity. Behind them, smoke drifted through the ruins of a country that no longer existed. For centuries, uniforms had defined the German sense of order. Prussian discipline, industrial precision, national pride. But that day in 1945, the uniform became a curse. And as its ashes settled on the wet earth, the myth of the invincible Reich, the empire that had promised eternity, vanished with it. The fires had burned away the symbols, but what came after would burn deeper, into memory, conscience, and history itself. The flames faded slowly. What began as ceremony ended as exhaustion. The smell of smoke lingered over the fields for hours, clinging to hair, hands, and memory. When the last embers died, there was only stillness, the kind that feels heavier than sound. The women stood motionless, watching the gray ash drift upward into the pale morning sky. The uniforms were gone. The Reich was gone. And for the first time, so was certainty. For years, they had been told that serving Germany meant serving destiny. Every letter they typed, every message they transmitted, every wounded soldier they bandaged was part of a divine purpose, the rise of a new order. Now that illusion was gone, stripped away by surrender and flame. Some stood weeping quietly, others numb, staring at their empty hands as if realizing for the first time that those hands had never belonged to them. They had belonged to the Reich. In one POW camp outside Lübeck, an Allied observer wrote, "After the burnings, they seemed broken, not from fear, but from emptiness, as if something inside them had burned along with the cloth. It was more than defeat. It was the disintegration of meaning itself. The Third Reich had not just demanded obedience, it had built identity. Every uniform was a promise of belonging, purity, and control. When that promise turned to ash, it left behind nothing to believe in." Across the ruins of Germany, similar scenes unfolded. Former Nazi officials hid or fled. Soldiers discarded weapons. Flags disappeared overnight. What had once been shouted from every podium, "Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer," was now unspeakable. In towns occupied by British and American forces, the swastika became contraband. Possession of any Nazi emblem could mean arrest. Women who had once worn those symbols with pride now feared even to whisper their past. And yet, the memory of burning them stayed vivid. It was the point of no return, the moment when the mythology of the Reich finally turned against itself. One British officer later reflected, "You could see it in their faces, that they finally understood the scale of the lie. It was not anger we saw, but awakening. But awakening brings pain." The first weeks of captivity were filled with silence. Allied officers noted that the women spoke little, even among themselves. Some refused to eat. Others spent hours staring at the fences or the sky, as if waiting for something that would never come. Nighttime in the camps was worse. The darkness reminded them of the bomb shelters, of nights when sirens wailed and orders shouted through radios. But now there were no sirens, no orders, only memories. Psychiatrists who later interviewed female POWs described psychic dislocation, a loss of personal continuity. They had entered the war believing themselves noble. They emerged feeling complicit, though few understood in what exactly. One former Helferin, detained in a British camp, later wrote in her journal, "When I close my eyes, I still see the fire. I see the smoke twisting like ghosts. I remember thinking, this is what truth must look like when it burns." Even in defeat, remnants of Nazi discipline lingered. Some women continued to line up for roll call, even when the guards told them it was unnecessary. Others polished their boots with improvised cloth, maintaining a ritual that no longer had meaning. It was not loyalty. It was habit, the last trace of order in chaos. But as days turned to weeks, the collective silence began to fracture. Some spoke in whispers about what they had heard, about camps, executions, and the Holocaust. Allied officers sometimes showed them photographs from liberated concentration camps. The reactions varied: shock, denial, horror. For many, the dissonance was unbearable. How could the nation of Beethoven and Goethe have built gas chambers? How could their service, once seen as patriotic, now feel like complicity? The burning of uniforms had been the first symbolic act. But this confrontation with truth, was the true fire. At the same time, far to the south, Berlin lay in ruins. Soviet troops patrolled streets that still smelled of smoke and blood. In shattered courtyards, other fires burned. Piles of Nazi flags, portraits, medals. Civilians, terrified of arrest, destroyed any sign of loyalty to the regime. Women who had once served as secretaries in the ministries of propaganda or the SS tore insignia from their sleeves and burned them secretly at night. One Soviet soldier later described seeing a woman crying over a smoldering armband before burying its ashes in the dirt. It was as if the entire country was performing the same act, a nation burning its own reflection. When the Allied guards dismissed the women from the field, after the burnings, no one spoke. They walked slowly toward the camp, some barefoot, carrying only blankets and ration tins. Behind them, the fires still crackled faintly. A wind rose, scattering the ashes across the grass. It carried fragments of buttons, threads, and insignia. Fragments of the empire that had promised eternity. And in that moment, something irreversible happened. The transformation from soldier to survivor. There was no triumph, no music, no glory, only quiet acceptance that the world they had known, disciplined, certain, ordered, had been built on lies. The fire had destroyed their uniforms. History would destroy their innocence. And from that silence would come the hardest chapter of all, the reckoning with guilt, memory, and survival. The flames were gone, but their smoke hung over Germany like a shroud, dark and lingering. And as the nation rebuilt from ashes, the question remained: what became of those who had served? Once the symbols were gone. The war was over, but peace did not come easily. Germany in 1945 was a landscape of silence, burned cities, broken bridges, and endless lines of displaced people. Amid the wreckage, the women who had served the Nazi regime found themselves stripped not only of their uniforms, but of purpose. In Allied custody, they were processed like soldiers but treated as something in between. Not quite prisoners, not quite civilians. Their official classification varied from camp to camp. Some were designated military auxiliaries, others simply attached personnel. For many, it was the first time they were addressed not by rank or title, but by name. Name? Anna Richter. Occupation? Clerk, Luftwaffe. Reason for service? A pause. Duty. The British and Americans established special POW camps for women, primarily in northern Germany. Conditions were far better than those in Soviet hands. Prisoners received food, medical care, and the chance to write censored letters home. But psychologically, they were broken. One Allied interpreter recalled, "They followed orders without hesitation, even now. You could see the habit of obedience still inside them." Many of these women refused to believe the full truth of Nazi crimes. They had heard rumors of atrocities but dismissed them as propaganda. When Allied officers presented them with photographs from liberated camps, the corpses, the barbed wire, the horror, some fainted, others cried, and a few turned away in silence. A nurse from Dresden whispered to a British major, "We thought we were helping. We did not know what the help was for." Denial was both a shield and a wound. The reality of genocide clashed violently with years of indoctrination. For women raised under Nazi education, the moral collapse was unbearable. They had believed in service and sacrifice. Now they saw where that obedience had led. The Allies introduced Entnazifizierung, the systematic re-education of the German people. In the camps, women attended lectures and watched films exposing Nazi crimes. They were given reading materials banned under Hitler, encouraged to think critically, to question orders, to understand freedom. At first, the reaction was resentment. Many saw these sessions as punishment, not enlightenment. But gradually, cracks formed in the wall of denial. Some began asking questions. Others volunteered for reconstruction work, clearing rubble from bombed streets, helping refugees, nursing civilians. One American psychologist described the transformation. You could see their faces change as the weeks went on. They began to look forward, not back. The uniforms were gone, but a different kind of strength started to appear. In contrast, women captured by the Soviets faced a far darker fate. Tens of thousands were marched eastward into camps in Poland, Belarus, and Siberia. Many never returned. For the Red Army, revenge was personal. Their families had been slaughtered, their cities burned. Mercy was rare. Those who survived Soviet captivity returned years later, aged beyond recognition. They spoke little of what they endured. Some bore physical scars. Most carried invisible ones. In the Western zones, life slowly resumed a fragile normalcy. Former auxiliaries were eventually released, allowed to return to their homes if they still existed. But reintegration was almost impossible. Society saw them as symbols of a shameful past. Families avoided questions. Neighbors whispered. The women who had once marched proudly in crisp uniforms now moved quietly through the ruins, heads lowered, avoiding eye contact. Some burned the last remnants of insignia themselves, not out of obedience this time, but out of the need to forget. Freedom did not feel like liberation. It felt like displacement. They no longer belonged to the world they had served, nor yet to the new Germany rising from the ashes. Their skills, typing, organizing, discipline, were valuable in rebuilding. But their history was not, so they worked silently in hospitals, schools, and offices, rarely speaking of the war. Many never married. Others built families, but kept their stories locked away, passing only fragments to their children. The uniform had been burned, but the memory of wearing it remained. Heavy as iron, impossible to remove. By 1946, Germany was rebuilding under Allied supervision. Cities cleared of rubble began to hum again with life. But beneath that recovery lay the unspoken truth. Millions were still haunted by what they had believed. And for the women who had once stood in those smoky fields, the war had ended, but the reckoning had only just begun. The years after 1945 were not marked by peace, but by forgetting. Germany had to rebuild, cities, economy, and conscience alike. But there was little room for the stories of women who had once served in uniform. They were ghosts in daylight, living among the ruins yet belonging to neither past nor present. When the POW camps closed and the women returned home, most found their towns flattened and their families scattered. The men who survived the front came back hardened, bitter, and often silent themselves. But for the women who had worn the gray and black of the Reich, silence was not a choice. It was survival. In post-war Germany, association with the Nazi regime was a stigma. Neighbors avoided them. Employers hesitated to hire them. In villages, whispers followed them. She was with the Luftwaffe. She worked for the SS. Some were accused of collaboration. Others simply vanished into anonymity. The female auxiliaries who had once believed they were serving the nation now carried the guilt of a defeated empire. They avoided mentioning their service even to their children. For decades, families grew up unaware that their mothers or grandmothers had ever worn uniforms. In one 1950 diary, a former radio operator wrote, "I do not tell my son what I was. I want him to believe I was only a nurse. He would not understand what it meant to believe in something so completely, and to see it die." By the 1950s, West Germany was rebuilding rapidly under the Marshall Plan. New industries rose, cities regained light, and democracy took root. The new government, seeking stability, avoided reopening wounds too soon. Official silence became national policy. The sins of the fathers and the mothers were buried beneath reconstruction. Many of the former Helferinnen found work in government offices, hospitals, and schools. Their discipline, organization, and technical training, once products of Nazi efficiency, made them valuable in rebuilding the new state. Yet they were never acknowledged as veterans or victims. They existed in the gray zone of history, neither condemned nor redeemed. In the East, under Soviet influence, their fate was harsher. The communist regime portrayed them as examples of fascist corruption, using them as propaganda for ideological re-education. Some were sent to labor camps or collective farms. Others were pressured into public confessions. Their stories were rewritten to serve anew. By the 1960s and 70s. A new generation of Germans began asking questions. Young students, unscarred by war, wanted to know what their parents had done and why they had been silent. The women who had served under Hitler found themselves cornered between shame and explanation. Some broke their silence in interviews or memoirs, often anonymously. Their recollections were hauntingly similar, not of battle, but of belief. They spoke of pride, duty, and the quiet collapse that followed surrender. Most insisted they had not known of the regime's atrocities, though historians debated this claim. One survivor wrote to a journalist in 1972, "We were told we were defending our people. No one told us we were defending murderers." For many, the act of burning their uniforms had become the central memory of their lives. The moment when reality shattered illusion. That single act, once ordered by strangers, became their private symbol of repentance. In later decades, as archives opened and historians re-examined the Nazi era, the stories of German women in uniform began to surface. Documentaries, academic studies, and survivor accounts revealed the complexity of their roles. Not merely victims of propaganda, but active participants in a regime built on obedience. Their story became a warning, not of evil alone, but of human frailty, how conviction, duty, and conformity can blind even the ordinary to the monstrous. Modern historians describe them as invisible soldiers, the silent backbone of a totalitarian system that thrived on efficiency and loyalty. Their uniforms had burned, but their labor had kept the Reich functioning until its final hour. And yet, behind that machinery of obedience, there was always the human heart, confused, afraid, searching for meaning in the ruins. By the time Germany was whole again, most of those women had passed away, their secrets buried with them. But their story endures. In faded photographs, in letters never sent, in memories passed down quietly through families. The fire that consumed their uniforms did not end with smoke. It lingered. In guilt, in silence, in the fragile lessons left for the generations that followed. For every woman who threw her uniform into the flames that spring of 1945, there was a moment of awakening. The realization that loyalty without conscience is the most dangerous weapon of all. And from those ashes, Germany was forced to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul. The uniforms were gone, but the questions remained. Questions that still echo whenever a nation mistakes obedience for virtue. The smoke had cleared. The war was over, but history was only beginning to understand what that fire had truly burned away. The fire that burned in those German fields in 1945 was not just the end of a war, it was the end of illusion. The uniforms that turned to ash that day were more than fabric. They were faith woven into form, identity stitched to obedience. When they burned, so did an entire generation's certainty about who they were and what they believed. History often remembers wars through battles and generals, through maps and treaties. But sometimes, history is defined by quiet acts, by a moment of silence around a burning pile of cloth. When a human soul realizes the cost of its own conviction, those German women had not stormed beaches or commanded armies, yet they had served the machinery that made such horrors possible. Their obedience, so ordinary in its intent, became extraordinary in its consequence. And, in the reflection of that fire, humanity was forced to confront a painful truth. Evil does not always wear a monster's face. Sometimes it wears a uniform, neat, pressed, and unquestioning. The Allied order to burn those symbols was meant to cleanse, to erase the visual traces of tyranny. But its deeper effect was spiritual. It forced those who obeyed to see what obedience had done, to confront the emptiness left when blind faith collapses. From those ashes, Germany began again, humbled, shattered, searching for conscience. The women who had once believed they were serving glory became witnesses to ruin. And perhaps, in that transformation, they offered the first quiet lesson of the New World, that no ideology, however grand, can survive the truth of its own humanity. The fires went out long ago. The fields grew green again, but in the stillness of history, you can almost hear the whisper of fabric burning, a reminder that belief without question and power without mercy always end the same way, in silence, in smoke, and in the long shadow of what was once called destiny.